Hello everyone, welcome back to Boss Economic World. I'm your host. Today is November 22nd, 2025. Grab your coffee, or if you're a German industrialist, perhaps something stronger. Because today we are looking at the sobering reality of Europe's former economic engine. We've been tracking the slow-motion train wreck of the German economy for a few years now, but this week, the train didn't just derail, it formally admitted that it doesn't even own the tracks anymore. German Vice Chancellor and Finance Minister Lars Klingbeil has just wrapped up a high-stakes visit to Beijing. The headline goal? A reset of ties. The actual result? A masterclass in diplomatic theater that exposed just how much leverage has shifted from the Rhine to the Yangtze. In this episode, we're going to peel back the layers of this visit. We aren't just looking at the handshakes, we are looking at the trade balances, the rare earth chokeholds, and the catastrophic decline of the Made in Germany premium. We're going to explain why the world's third largest economy is currently stuck in a doom loop of its own making, and why a handshake in Beijing might just be a farewell wave to Germany's status as an industrial superpower. Let's get into it. First, let's set the scene. The political landscape in Berlin has changed, but the problems have not. We are looking at the government of Chancellor Friedrich Merz. For those who don't follow the Bundestag drama, Merz took office promising a return to strength. Yet, his Vice Chancellor, Lars Klingbeil, just spent the last few days in China essentially trying to ensure that Germany's lights stay on. Klingbeil's trip was billed as an attempt to secure reliable access and reliable supply chains for critical raw materials. Now, translate that from diplomat speak to English. It means, please don't cut us off. Germany is desperate. Why? Because the German economy is currently putting up numbers that would make a recession look like a boom. We are looking at a country that has endured 2 consecutive years of contraction in 2023 and 2024. And now, as we close out 2025, we are staring down the barrel of another lost year. Growth is stagnant. The IFO Institute Business Climate Index is flashing red. The famed Mittelstand, those small to medium enterprises that form the backbone of the economy, are facing an insolvency rate we haven't seen since the early 2000s. So, Klingbeil goes to China. He meets with Vice Premier He Lifeng. He gives a speech at Peking University. And what does he bring back? A suitcase full of unenforceable promises. The Chinese government agreed to strengthen economic and financial cooperation. They promised reliable access. Klingbeil, in a moment of candid weakness, admitted to reporters that Germany's power to enforce these pledges amounts to little more than reminding them of what they said. Imagine you lend your neighbor $10,000, and his repayment plan is a promise that he'll try his best, and your only recourse is to politely remind him of it next Christmas. That is the current state of German foreign economic policy. Let's dig deeper into the why. Why is Germany so vulnerable? It comes down to the periodic table. Specifically, the nasty stuff at the bottom that makes the modern world work. Rare earth elements. Back in the golden era of globalization, Germany outsourced the messy business of mining and refining to China. It was efficient. It was cheap. It boosted margins for Siemens, BMW, and BASF. But in 2025, efficiency has been replaced by weaponization. Earlier this year, we saw Beijing limit exports of gallium and germanium essential for semiconductors in response to tariff saber-rattling from Washington. The German auto industry, which is already gasping for air while trying to pivot to EVs, nearly had a heart attack. Here is the kicker, and it is a hilarious tragedy of bureaucracy. Germany knew this was coming. The previous administration in Berlin launched a much-hyped raw materials fund designed to diversify supply chains. They allocated about €1 billion to it. Do you want to guess how many projects that fund has successfully completed as of November 2025? 0. Not one. While China was locking down lithium mines in South America and cobalt in Africa, Berlin was still filling out the paperwork for the committee that oversees the subcommittee for raw material acquisition. The fund is too small, too slow, and completely paralyzed by risk aversion. So, when Klingbeil stands in Beijing and talks about diversification, the Chinese officials nod politely. They know the math. They know that for the next 5 to 10 years, if Germany wants to build an electric motor, a wind turbine, or a guidance system, they need China. And no amount of stern speeches from the Chancellor's office changes the geology or the refining capacity. Now, we have to zoom out. You cannot understand the German predicament without looking at the two giants in the room, the United States and China. It is late 2025. Donald Trump is back in the White House. His approach to trade is about as subtle as a sledgehammer. He is pushing for total decoupling. He wants Europe to pick a side. On the other side, you have President Xi Jinping. China is dealing with its own slowdown, sure, but it has successfully pivoted its manufacturing base toward the new three, EVs, batteries, and renewables. Germany is the ham in this geopolitical sandwich. Berlin's strategy, termed de-risking, was supposed to be the clever middle path. The idea was, we will keep trading with China, but we won't be dependent on them. Sander Tordwar, the chief economist of the Center for European Reform, put it perfectly this week: the question is whether the de-risking that this buy-time strategy aims to deliver is moving fast enough. Spoiler alert, it isn't. The buy time strategy has failed because you can only buy time if you use it to fix your problems. Germany used the time to argue about budget deficits. Germany relies on the US for security and on China for prosperity. But those two pillars are now moving in opposite directions. Trump is demanding Germany spend more on defense and cut ties with China. China is demanding Germany ignore the US and keep the markets open. When Foreign Minister Johann Wadephul tried to criticize Beijing's aggressive behavior around Taiwan earlier this year, his trip was suddenly rescheduled by Beijing. That's diplomatic code for you are in a timeout. Klingbeil's visit was the apology tour. And the Chinese state media loved it. The Global Times praised him as the voice of reason. When an authoritarian state's propaganda arm calls you the voice of reason, it usually means you just gave them exactly what they wanted. Let's talk about the money. Why is the German economy, the former export Weltmeister, in such a funk? For decades, the German model was simple: import cheap energy from Russia, import cheap intermediate goods from China, add high-quality German engineering, and export expensive finished goods to the world. That model is dead. It was murdered by three things. 1. The end of cheap Russian gas. 2. The rise of Chinese competition. 3. The EV transition. Let's focus on the car industry. It is the beating heart of Germany. In 2025, VW, Mercedes, and BMW are fighting for their lives in the Chinese market. BYD and Xiaomi are eating their lunch. This is why the EU is paralyzed. Brussels wants to be tough. They have this thing called the anti-coercion instrument. It sounds like a sci-fi weapon, but it's actually a legal framework that allows the EU to slap massive sanctions on countries that bully member states. But they won't use it against China. Why? Because the moment they do, Beijing will slap a tariff on German luxury cars. And since the German economy is already contracting, Chancellor Merz cannot afford to let the auto industry collapse. So, despite the tough talk from Brussels about tariffs on Chinese EVs, the retaliation is minimal. The EU is barking, but it has muzzled itself because it's afraid the mailman will bite back. There is one area where Germany has drawn a line, but even that is messy. Klingbeil faced pressure regarding the removal of Chinese components from German 5G networks. The deadline is set for 2029. Chancellor Merz has vowed that no Chinese tech will be in the future 6G networks. This seems tough, right? But look at the timeline, 2029. That is 4 years away. In the world of tech, 4 years is an eternity. By allowing the equipment to stay until 2029, Germany is essentially saying, we will secure our network, but only after we've squeezed every last cent of value out of the hardware we already bought. It's a classic German compromise: fiscally prudent, security risky. Perhaps the most delusional part of Klingbeil's trip was the geopolitical posturing. According to insiders, Klingbeil tried to lobby Wang Huning, Xi Jinping's ideological brain, to help end the war in Ukraine. He suggested China could achieve what Trump failed at. Let's analyze the game theory here. Why would China help Europe crush Russia? Russia is currently China's gas station and junior partner. A weakened, isolated Russia is perfect for Beijing. Klingbeil asking China to stop the war is like a turkey asking the butcher to become a vegetarian. It ignores the fundamental incentives of the other party. Then there is Taiwan. Klingbeil voiced concern over military escalation, saying it would change everything. But here is the brutal truth: if a conflict over Taiwan breaks out, the German economy doesn't just contract, it implodes. Estimates suggest a Taiwan blockade would cost the global economy $2 trillion. For Germany, which is more trade-dependent than any other G7 nation, it would be a death blow to its industrial base. Beijing knows this. They know Germany's threat is empty because Germany cannot afford the cost of the threat being realized. This is why Professor Fong Fong at Peking University condescendingly invited the audience to applaud Klingbeil as the voice of reason. He wasn't praising his intellect, he was praising his submission. So, where does this leave us? The narrative of the boss economic world is usually about following the money to find the truth. The money tells us that the balance of power has shifted permanently. Germany is no longer a peer competitor to China. It is a supplicant. Chancellor Merz is trying to project strength, but his vice chancellor's trip revealed the structural weakness. The German model, export-led growth, powered by combustion engines and heavy industry, is obsolete in a world dominated by software, AI, and battery supply chains controlled by the US and China. The tragic irony is that Germany is still rich, still has brilliant engineers, and still has massive capital. But it is paralyzed by a political system that refuses to accept that the old world is gone. They are building raw material funds that don't spend money. They are setting deadlines for 2029 for problems that exist today. They are making reminders instead of ultimatums. Klingbeil left Beijing on cordial terms. Foreign Minister Wadephul might visit later this year. Chancellor Merz might even get a photo op with Xi. But make no mistake, the era of the West lecturing the East on economics is over. Germany is now struggling to navigate a world where it is neither big enough to dictate the rules nor agile enough to play by someone else's. As we look at the charts for 2026, the question isn't will Germany recover? The question is, what does the managed decline of an industrial superpower look like? Right now, it looks like a polite handshake in Beijing, accompanied by a promise you know they won't keep. That's the reality. The numbers don't lie, even if the politicians do. I'm your host, this is Boss Economic World. If you want to understand which currencies might survive the German decline, click the video on the left. If you want to see our analysis of Trump's tariff war, click the right. See you next time.